If decades of sanctions, military strikes, and economic pressure have not forced Iran to surrender, what makes America believe the next round of sanctions will let Iran finally surrender? On today's episode, we dive deep into how effective sanctions has been against Iran. Before you continue, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So, on August 20th, 2026, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced the U.S. would impose what he called the toughest sanctions in history on Iran. This comes after President Trump threatened Iran with economic D-Day that will target Iran and other countries that continue giving Iran any sort of economic support. President Trump and Scott Bessent's comments sound very interesting because they are presenting sanctions on Iran as a new way to collapse the country. Indeed, very interesting. To begin with, Iran's economic war with America didn't begin yesterday or last year. Nope. It began in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution. And from that time, Iran has learned how to survive sanctions for almost half a century. It started on October 1979, when the United States allowed Iran's deposed Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into America for medical treatment. To Iranians, this raised a terrifying question. Is America preparing to help the deposed Shah return to power? Iranians were not wrong to think that way because, in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence helped overthrow Iran's elected prime minister by name, Mohammad Mossadegh, and restore the Shah's position, which didn't sit well with the Iranians. So after their 1979 revolution, many Iranians remained deeply suspicious of America's plans of repeating such events. Then on November 4th, 1979, Iranian students entered the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and what they found inside the embassy reinforced their suspicions. They discovered large quantities of diplomatic and intelligence-related documents, including material concerning Iranian political contacts, military cooperation, and U.S. dealings with Iranian figures. Some documents were also used by the students to identify local people they believed were working with American intelligence. America confirmed that indeed, embassy files containing information on local sources, political contacts, and military cooperation had fallen into Iranian hands. The students therefore started seeing the embassy as more than a diplomatic mission. They called it an espionage den and believed that America was continuing to interfere in Iran's affairs. The U.S. government rejected that accusation, but the documents the students seized became a major part of the Iranian justification to hold Americans at the American embassy in Tehran as hostages. What began as a protest that the students initially intended to be temporary became a 444-day hostage crisis. Yes, and from this point, the sanctions story for Iran started. The United States, in response to the hostage crisis, started with economic pressure, including freezing Iranian assets, among others. It is not one single sanction that is lasting continuously for 47 years. Sanctions on Iran developed in stages. Iranian banks were targeted. Its oil exports were targeted. Shipping companies were targeted. Insurance companies were targeted. Businesses were targeted. Individuals and government officials were targeted. And eventually, the United States developed something even more powerful called the secondary sanctions. So secondary sanctions means that America will tell companies in other countries around the world, you can do business with Iran if you want, but if you do, your country or company lose access to the American financial system. This is how American sanctions on Iran became much tougher. It started as, America will not trade with Iran, to, America will punish anyone doing business with Iran. As previously discussed, 1979 was the beginning. Iranian assets were frozen, trade and financial restrictions followed, and the relationship between Washington and Tehran deteriorated dramatically. 1980s to 1990s, the sanction expanded. America increasingly targeted Iranian trade, investment, banking, and strategic sectors. In the 2000s, the nuclear sanctions started. The nuclear program became a major focus in the 2000s, and because of that, Washington and its allies increasingly targeted Iran's oil industry, banks, shipping, insurance, energy investment, individuals and companies, and finally, access to international financial systems. 2010s, the maximum financial pressure started. The sanctions during this period became much more sophisticated. Iran wasn't simply being told, hey, you cannot trade with America. The message became, if you trade with Iran, your company will lose access to the American financial system. These kind of restrictions are a much more powerful weapon because the United States can use the dollar and access to its financial system to pressure third parties and countries. In 2012, under President Obama, America announced what it described by then the most crippling sanctions in the history of sanctions. Iran has survived all these sanctions, even though it has greatly reduced its economy. Yet they have been resilient and successful in managing those sanctions. President Trump's latest threat isn't a new threat to the Iranians, so it isn't simply whether Iran can survive the next American sanctions or not. It's whether other parties and countries like China, India, shipping companies, banks, insurers, and others are willing to risk American sanctions to continue trading with Iran. China is a key player here because Beijing remains Iran's major oil customer, and America has been trying to pressure the Chinese side of the Iranian oil trade. Reuters reported that Besant specifically called on China to cooperate, but China has categorically stated they won't abide by these sanctions they call illegal on Iran. Because of China's resilience, the new sanctions are much more aggressive because America wants to punish the entire network, keeping Iran's economy alive. And this is one of the reasons Iran has spent decades trying to build ways around the sanctions. Because of the sanctions, Iran now understands that if you depend completely on Western banks, Western companies, and Western markets, then America has enormous leverage over you anytime they want. So Iran began adapting by building different systems to bypass those sanctions. 1. Alternative financial networks. When major international banks become inaccessible, Iran uses smaller banks, intermediaries, exchange houses, and informal financial channels. 2. Shadow oil network. Iran doesn't necessarily need to sell oil through a transparent Western-style system. It can use intermediaries, ship-to-ship transfers, different ownership structures, and other methods to disguise the origin and destination of cargo. The U.S. Treasury itself has been targeting Iranian shadow fleet shipping companies and vessels because these networks have become an important source of revenue for Tehran. 3. China, as we know, imports most of its oil from Iran, and till date, they remain Iran's most important economic lifeline. China has continued buying Iranian oil despite U.S. pressure and sanctions. Reporting in 2026 has described China's role in keeping Iran's shadow oil trade functioning. Iran doesn't really need every country in the world to trade with. It only needs enough buyers around, and China is a huge trade partner. 4. Domestic adaptation. Iran has had decades to replace imports, develop domestic industries, and learn how to operate with restricted access to Western technology and capital. Let's emphasize on this a little bit. This doesn't mean sanctions don't hurt countries and the people. They absolutely do. They create costs, disrupt trade, restrict technology, will force countries to restructure parts of its economy, among others. But history has taught us that economic pain and political capitulation are two completely different things. Sanctions will weaken an economy, but it can't weaken the nation's willingness to fight. A perfect example is Russia. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Western countries imposed enormous sanctions targeting banks, energy, technology, individuals, foreign reserves, exports, imports, shipping, and investment. But sanctions did not let Russia capitulate. Russia adapted and redirected trade toward countries such as China and India, developed alternative payment arrangements, and continued exporting commodities. Then there's Cuba. The United States began imposing economic sanctions on Cuba from 1960, also after the Cuban Revolution and nationalization of American interests. Cuba since then has lived under major U.S. economic restrictions for about 66 years. As time went on, Cuba's sanctions subsequently became much broader. Cuba is currently suffering enormously, but suffering does not automatically equal capitulation or surrender. The government and people are surviving, the political system is surviving, and Cuba has adapted through relationships with other states and alternative economic arrangements. So Cuba also tells us that economic punishment can endure for generations without producing political surrender. Back to Iran, which is a much harder target for sanctions because Iran isn't Cuba or some small Caribbean island. Iran has around 90 million people, enormous oil and gas reserves, a large domestic industrial base, major regional influence, a large military-industrial structure, extensive experience with sanctions, strategic geography, relationships with China and other economies, established sanctions evasion networks, and most importantly, the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has already been living under sanctions for decades, so what Trump and Bessent is doing is not like imposing economic sanctions on a country that has never experienced it. Nope. Iran has had 47 years to learn how to live with sanctions. Iran knows which companies can be used, which financial channels can be used, which countries are willing to cooperate, how to sell oil under restrictions, how to move money outside the traditional Western financial system, and on top of it all, Iran knows that these sanctions are designed to create political pressure and internal instability. People ask, how much economic pain can Iran absorb before the pain becomes political pressure on the government? Truth is, sanctions can reduce government revenue, weaken currency, increase inflation, reduce imports, hurt businesses, increase unemployment, reduce living standards, and create public anger. But then public anger does not necessarily mean the regime change President Trump and Bessent expect to see. A country like Iran under such sanctions can respond with greater repression, subsidies, rationing, nationalism, alternative trade networks, or even blaming the foreign enemy. Aside this, during wartime, external pressure and economic sanctions produce the opposite of what economic sanctions are intended to achieve. Instead of weakening national unity, sanctions and external pressure mostly strengthen the people. This is the reality because people who are already suffering will start to blame the foreign government, imposing the sanctions on them rather than their own government. And that nationalism and unity among Iranians is exactly the kind of outcome Trump and Bessent do not want to see from their sanctions strategy against Iran, which is aimed at creating internal divisions and toppling the government. Iran's economy, after surviving decades of sanctions, is already under enormous pressure. Recent reporting says inflation is near 70%, while the economy is projected to contract by more than 5%. Looking at this, these new sanctions will definitely cause pains and affect the Iranian economy. But can the sanctions make Iran surrender? Those are not the same outcome. Iran doesn't have to make its economy too good or too healthy to survive these sanctions. It only has to keep the system alive. The United States can easily sanction an Iranian oil company, tanker, bank, and others. But what happens when the entire network behind those transactions stretches across multiple countries, companies, intermediaries, and shipping routes? Then America has to decide how far it is willing to go. For instance, since China is a major trading partner of Iran, will America sanction the Chinese companies? Will it sanction the Chinese banks? Will it sanction the Chinese shipping companies? And will it threaten China and other countries that continue purchasing Iranian oil? All these additional steps, if implemented, will definitely increase the economic pressure on Iran. But it also increases the possibility of a much larger confrontation between America, China, and other countries that have their own interests. This is why the latest sanctions announced by President Trump and Bessent is not about Iran and America anymore, but also involves other partners who are trading with Iran. And as much as these sanctions sound a bit scary for Iran, they have an advantage. If China continues buying Iranian oil, if companies continue transporting it, if financial intermediaries continue processing transactions, if countries continue providing Iran with goods and technology, then the sanctions become a game of pressure and adaptation. So America increases the pressure. Iran finds another route. America closes that route. Iran finds another route. This is what Iran has been doing to survive sanctions for decades. Because unlike a country with very few natural resources, Iran has something the world continues to need, which is energy. Iran has some of the world's largest proven oil and natural gas reserves. That means sanctions can make Iranian oil harder and more expensive to sell. But the demand for Iranian oil is still there. Someone is still willing to buy it. And if there is a buyer willing to take the risk, there will always be an incentive for someone to find a way to move the oil. This is why the so-called shadow fleet has become so important, because sanctioned ships can change ownership. Sanctioned companies can be registered in different jurisdictions. Sanctioned cargoes can be transferred between vessels. Sanctioned payments can move through intermediaries. And through all these, the final buyer doesn't necessarily have to deal directly with the Iranian government. America identifies a network trading with Iran and sanctions it. The network adapts and changes identity. A new company emerges, another ship takes over, and a new financial channel is created trading with Iran. And the cycle begins again, more or less like a game of cat and mouse. But not just that. Iran has another advantage, which is geography. As we know by now, Iran sits next to the Persian Gulf and directly beside the Strait of Hormuz. Around a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids consumption passes through the strait, and that gives Iran huge strategic importance in the global energy market. So Washington can pressure Iran economically, but the global economy is also highly sensitive to what happens around Iran. If sanctions dramatically reduce Iranian oil exports, global prices will rise. If tensions increase around the Strait of Hormuz, global markets will react. And if Iran retaliates against economic pressure by threatening energy infrastructure or shipping routes beside the Strait of Hormuz, the consequences don't remain inside Iran, but far from the Persian Gulf to the food we eat in our various homes. If America retwants to squeeze Iran's oil revenue while simultaneously preventing a major spike in global oil prices, it has to balance two competing objectives. Cut Iran's exports, but don't create a global energy shock. Because if oil prices rise sharply, Iran will earn more money from every barrel it successfully sells. And countries that depend heavily on imported energy will begin feeling the consequences of the sanctions themselves. So the sanctions strategy on Iran will have another effect, which is the harder you try to remove Iranian oil from the market, the more valuable the remaining Iranian oil can become. That doesn't mean Iran wins. Nope. This means Iran doesn't need the entire world to cooperate with it. It only needs enough buyers to keep the economic lifeline open with this. If most Western companies leave Iran, Chinese buyers will remain. If American banks refuse Iranian transactions, alternative financial channels remain, and if sanctioned shipping companies disappear, new intermediaries replace them. So for Iran to surrender as America wants, it requires something much more difficult. It requires the leadership in Iran to conclude that resistance is no longer worth the cost. Let's surrender. But after nearly 5 decades of sanctions, Iran has already shown America that resistance is their code of honor. One will ask, what happens if sanctions don't let Iran surrender? Then America moves back to its other option, which is the military force. And we've already seen results of the military force. And sorry to say, the military option failed to achieve any of its goals. So that is probably not an option for now. Destroying military infrastructure is not the same thing as destroying a country's willingness to resist. In fact, military attacks create the same effect that economic pressure creates, which is national unity. When people believe their country is under direct attack from a foreign power, political differences can temporarily become less important. That means America can theoretically create economic pain, destroy infrastructure, and weaken Iran's military and economic strength, and will still fail to achieve political capitulation. People ask this question a lot. What exactly does America want to achieve with the sanctions that military action couldn't achieve? Does it mean Iran agrees to restrictions on its nuclear program? Does it mean Iran stops supporting regional allies? Does it mean Iran accepts limits on its missile program? Does it mean regime change? Or does it simply mean Iran becomes economically too weak to continue challenging American interests? These are very different objectives, and the harder the objective, the more difficult sanctions alone become. Because if America is betting that the Iranian population will eventually become so desperate that it turns against the government, then they haven't studied the Iranian history. Iranian nationalism is at its peak. Iran has faced foreign pressure for decades, and every time the conflict is framed as Iran versus an outside power, the people rally around the flag. An Iranian can be deeply unhappy with the government and will still reject foreign attempts to force political change through external pressure. And if Iran survives the next round of sanctions, the question Washington will eventually have to answer is very simple. How much more pressure can you apply before Iran surrenders? Please take note of this final problem with assuming that sanctions will eventually force Iran to surrender, which is time. Sanctions are designed around the assumption that the pressure will eventually become unbearable. But that only works if the country being sanctioned collapses faster than the political will to resist it. Iran has already demonstrated that it can survive prolonged pressure. 47 years of sanctions have created something that didn't exist in Iran before 1979, which is an economy built around sanctions. So businesses have learned how to operate without normal access to Western markets. Smuggling networks have developed, alternative suppliers have emerged, new trading relationships have been established, and entire parts of the Iranian economy have adapted to restrictions that were originally supposed to be temporary. So every new round of sanctions enters an environment where Iran already knows what is coming. What is different this time is America is now threatening to target any party helping Iran. If that works, Iran's room to maneuver becomes much smaller this time. But if China and other countries continue finding ways to trade with Iran, then America will have limited options left for Iran to surrender. The United States would have to keep expanding the sanctions until Iran surrenders. More banks, more companies, more ships, more countries, more individuals, more secondary sanctions. And eventually the world will ask how much of the global economy is America willing to pressure in order to isolate Iran completely. That is where sanctions can become complicated, because the more aggressively Washington enforces them, the more other countries have an incentive to develop alternatives to the American financial system. And Iran is not alone in wanting those alternatives. Russia wants them. China has an interest in reducing its dependence on Western financial infrastructure. And other countries under American sanctions have the same incentive. Thing is, the United States uses its enormous financial power to force countries to comply. But the more frequently that power is used, the greater the incentive for targeted countries to find ways around it. And Iran has been one of the countries experimenting with those alternatives for decades. But inasmuch as Iran can bypass sanctions, let me reiterate that, Iran will still suffer from this new sanctions and will make Iran's economy much weaker. And this matters because a weaker economy means less money for the government, less investment, less ability to import technology, less money available for military programs and regional operations, and greater pressure on ordinary Iranians. So we shouldn't think that sanctions are useless. They aren't. But will sanctions let Iran capitulate or surrender? Nope. Because history gives us a definite answer. Cuba has been weakened economically, yet it hasn't surrendered. Russia is economically pressured, but hasn't surrendered. And Iran, too, has been sanctioned for decades, yet they have not surrendered. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated.
Welcome to Open Source Intelligence Vault, investigating the stories behind global events.